harmony between science and spirituality. Over 18 years, he has composed a 9-volume annotated translation of the Zohar Pritzker edition, which has been hailed as a monumental contribution to the history of Jewish thought. Currently, he teaches Zohar online. We will be distributing information about the online course at the end of this 2-session class. Daniel's father, Rabbi Hertelmat, served as the rabbi at the Jewish Center from 1970 to 1975. Daniel, it's all yours.
Thank you. Good to be with you. And I remember very warmly Princeton and the Jewish Center, where, as Moshe mentioned, my father was rabbi for 5 years. We're going to delve into the world of Kabbalah today and next Sunday. This can be a rather complex system, and I'm just picking out certain gems of the Kabbalah to give you a taste of the Jewish mystical tradition. I think that many of you have the PDFs that were sent out. Hopefully a number of you have those printed out. I will share the screen for part of the time to show you the text that we're studying. Let's begin with the word Kabbalah itself. It can be spelled various ways in English with a K or a C or a Q. The Hebrew word Kabbalah comes from the root kabel, which means to receive. So you could translate Kabbalah as receiving or that which has been received. It really refers to tradition, teachings that have been handed down over the ages, over the centuries, from master to disciple. So in that sense, Kabbalah is something very old or even ancient. On the other hand, receiving is something that we can do right now. If we're receptive, if we're in an open state of mind, we can discover new insights and new wisdom. And it's really that combination of new and ancient that makes the Kabbalah so intriguing. In fact, the Zohar, the major book of the Kabbalah, calls its teachings in Aramaic, Milin Chadetin Atikin, new ancient words. In other words, the Zohar is aware that its teachings are something brand new, often conveying radical new forms of theology. And at the same time, they are ancient in the sense that they go back to the earliest stages of the tradition. You could say the Kabbalah is trying to unpack what is hidden in the Bible. Much of the Kabbalah is a mystical interpretation of the Torah or other books in the Bible. There are ancient roots to the Jewish mystical tradition. You can find mystical themes in the Bible, in the prophets, in the Talmud. That really brings us to the question of what is mysticism. It's very hard to define, but you could say that mysticism is direct experience of God. In other words, the mystic is not satisfied with simply carrying out the divine commands. The mystic wants some contact with this ultimate reality. Now, if that's what mysticism is, we certainly see examples of that in the Bible. The Torah itself describes Moses' encounter with God at the burning bush. Prophets like Isaiah and Ezekiel describe their experiences, their encounters with God. But usually when we speak of Jewish mysticism, we're talking about a phenomenon later than the Bible, later than the Talmud or the Midrash. Kabbalah really, you could say, emerges in its full form in the Middle Ages in Europe, in the 12th and 13th centuries, first in southern France and Provence, and then spilling over the Pyrenees into Spain. And it was really in Spain in the 13th century that Kabbalah crystallized. That's where we find for the first time references to the book known as Sefer HaZohar, the book of radiance, the book of splendor. What is the Zohar? We will study some passages from the Zohar. The Zohar is a mystical commentary on the Torah. The author, it's not exactly clear exactly who wrote it and when it was written, but scholars Modern scholars of Kabbalah are pretty much agreed that the Zohar was composed mostly in Spain in the 13th century and largely by a man named Moses de Leon. Leon being a district in northwestern Spain. But Moses de Leon made a fantastic claim. He never admitted that he was the author of the Zohar. He claimed that he was copying from an ancient manuscript that went back over a millennium earlier to the 2nd century, and that it was composed in the circle of Rabbi Shimon, the son of Yochai, a famous teacher from the Mishnah. So this is strange. This is one of the strange things about the Zohar. It never appeared until 13th century Spain, and yet the author never admitted that he wrote the book. He claimed it was written back in the 2nd century, 1100 years earlier. Now, why did Moses de Leon attribute the book to this ancient Rabbi Shimon? Why didn't he come out and admit that he was the author, claim his authorship? Usually an author is very proud of what he's written. And here we find the exact opposite. The author of the greatest book of Jewish mysticism never admitted that he composed the book. I'm sure some of you can guess that he attributed the book to an ancient rabbi in order to increase its authority, so that the teachings of the Zohar would be accepted. Really, Moses de Leon is reimagining God and refashioning theology. And if he had come out and said that it was his own idea, many people would have objected. By claiming that it went back to an ancient source, he paved the way for the acceptance of the Zohar. I don't want to spend much time now on history and geography. I want us to devote most of our time to exploring the central teachings of the Kabbalah. And I would say basically that there are 3 important contributions that the Zohar and the Kabbalah make. And again, let's distinguish between Zohar and Kabbalah. People often use those two interchangeably. There's no book called the Kabbalah. The major book of the Kabbalah is the Zohar, and Kabbalah is a name for the whole philosophy, the whole movement of Jewish mysticism. So I may be using both of those terms, and just remember, the Zohar is the main book of the Kabbalah, and Kabbalah is a name for the whole movement, for the whole system. So what are these 3 important contributions of the Kabbalah? The first, I would say, is that God is infinity. The Hebrew term is Ein Sof. Ein, you could spell in English E-I-N, meaning there is not. Sof means end. So Ein Sof, there is no end, the infinite, infinity. In other words, for the Kabbalah, all of the names with which we're familiar, Elohim, Adonai, Tzivaot, Yud-He Vav-He, that unpronounceable name of God, all of the divine names are somehow inadequate and even inaccurate. No name captures the essence of God. As Maimonides had taught, the great Jewish philosopher, God cannot be comprehended. God cannot be put into our mental boxes, into our conceptual categories. By calling God Ein Sof, infinity, or the infinite, the Kabbalah is saying that our puny human minds cannot encompass the reality of God. God includes all things and transcends all things. And by calling God Ein Sof, we're acknowledging our inability to capture the divine, to define the divine. Infinity also means that which cannot be defined. So I would say that's one important contribution of the Kabbalah, that God is infinite, that God is beyond all of our conceptual categories, all of our names. Even the biblical names of God do not capture the infinite. Secondly, if we're going to talk about God at all, we have to repair a flaw. There is a problem with the biblical description of God, with the rabbinic description of God. You could say with all of Western religion, not only Judaism, but Judaism, Christianity, Islam. God is overwhelmingly masculine. The descriptions of God, the depictions of God are usually the warrior, the king, the judge, the father. And the Kabbalah insists that this is only part of the picture. God is equally masculine and feminine. The name for the feminine nature of God is Shekhinah, the divine presence, the indwelling presence of God. And we're going to explore some of the teachings about Shekhinah, because I think that certainly is one of the great contributions of the Kabbalah, to balance the patriarchal, masculine description of God with the feminine. So God is ultimately beyond all gender, beyond all description. Ein Sof, there is no end, the infinite. But if we're going to talk about God, we have to balance the masculine, the traditional descriptions of God, with the feminine, with Shekhinah. And the third important contribution is what the Kabbalah calls Tzorech Gavoa, the need on high. In other words, God actually needs something. Now that sounds very strange. Maimonides would say God needs nothing. In traditional religious language, God cannot be said to need anyone or anything. But the Kabbalah insists that God is incomplete without us, without human beings' active participation, without humans devoting themselves to holiness, to a spiritual life, to living in kindness, to practicing compassion, to cultivating spirituality. Without that, God is incomplete. So God needs the human being. We'll discuss that further as well. Let me pull up a chart here, a diagram. I hope that a good number of you have printed out the PDFs that were distributed. But in case not, we're going to look at this diagram of the 10 Sefirot. These are 10 qualities of God or 10 aspects of God. Now you might wonder, where is Ein Sof? Where is the ultimate reality of God? Where is the infinity? Of course, the infinite cannot be pictured, but you might say Ein Sof is the white space behind and between all of these spheres, all of these circles, and not, of course, not limited to this one white page on the screen, but then extending off in all directions infinitely. So Ein Sof transcends all of these qualities, all of these sfirot. We're not going to go into detail about these sfirot. That would take us all of today and next Sunday and beyond. I just want to point out a few highlights. Let's say that at the very top is Ein Sof, at the top and the bottom and all around, the infinite. But really the Sefirot, you could say, are the aspects of God's personality, the ways that that infinite divinity makes itself available, makes itself accessible to us. These are often pictured as a kind of organism or even a body. You might say a divine human body. Look at the very first one, Keter. Keter means crown. In each case, the Hebrew word, beneath the Hebrew word is the pronunciation, so this is Keter, and the meaning of that word is off to the right or the left in small capital letters. So Keter means crown, a crown on the head of this divine organism. The next two sfirot you could picture as the divine mind, or even the divine head. Chokhmah meaning wisdom, and Bina meaning understanding. So Keter is the crown on the divine head. Chokhmah and Bina are also described as father and mother. Chokhmah being father, and Bina being mother. Bina, the divine mother, gives birth to the 7 lower sefirot, beginning with Chesed, love, on the right, Gevurah, power, on the left, Tiferet, beauty, in the center. This is an example of how the Sefirot are divine qualities, but also human characteristics. Chesed, love, is something we can feel, that we feel for others, for our spouse, for our children, for our neighbor, ultimately for all of humanity, ideally. God also feels love for the world, but love by itself is not enough. Love has to be balanced with Gevurah, which is power, also known as Din, judgment. And one name I haven't written here is Pachad, fear or awe. So think of love and fear as the opposites, right? We love certain people, we fear certain people. Sometimes we even love and fear the same person, a spouse, a husband, or a wife, someone to whom we bear ourselves, someone whom we try to know intimately. We might feel love for that person and also some fear of opening up. So if we can balance love and power, love and judgment, love and fear, we end up at this middle quality of Tiferet, literally beauty, but also known as rachamim, compassion. So what is compassion? Compassion is balancing love and fear. The wonder of being alive, you might say, is chesed, and the fear of being alive, pachad or gevurah. The next triad are really, you could say, variations on the triad we just explored. Netzach, endurance, Hod, splendor, Yesod, foundation. In terms of the limbs of this divine organism, if Chochmah and Bina near the top are the head, Chesed is the right arm, Gevurah the left arm, Tiferet the trunk of the body, Netzach the right leg, Hod the left leg, Yesod the phallus, the center of male sexuality, and then we come to Malchut. Malchut is her technical Kabbalistic name, but she's also known as Shekhinah, the presence, the divine presence, and she is seen as the feminine dimension of God. I mentioned that up above you have Bina, the divine mother, Bina giving birth to these 7 lower Sefirot, and the last of them, Malchut or Shekhinah, is the daughter. Bina, the mother, and Malchut or Shekhinah, the daughter. The goal of this whole system is the union of the masculine and the feminine. The union of Tiferet, the masculine part of God, with Malchut or Shekhinah, the feminine part of God. This is just a quick overview. I'm sure I've said a lot and perhaps too much already. Please don't be concerned if it's somewhat perplexing. This is meant to be perplexing. Part of the Kabbalah, part of the Zohar is an intentional perplexity. I just wanted to show you a few highlights of the system, and later we'll look back at some of the qualities here, and especially Shekhinah, the feminine. Let's look now at the main text we'll be exploring. Those of you who printed this out, the title of this is Finding God in the Material World. But first, the first texts that we're going to look at are about Ein Sof, God as infinity. The 3 teachings on this page, on the left, the nature of God, on the right, 2 sections of non-duality, these all are written by a Kabbalist who lived a few hundred years after the Zohar. The Zohar was composed, as I said, in the 13th century. The man who wrote these teachings was named Moses, another Moses, not Moses de Leon, the main author of the Zohar, but Moses Cordovero. He was a Kabbalist who taught in Sfat, in Safed, that beautiful mountaintop city in the Galilee. And he lived and taught in the 16th century. And this is what he has to say about Ein Sof, the nature of God. An impoverished person thinks that God is an old man with white hair, sitting on a wondrous throne of fire that glitters with countless sparks. As the Bible states, the Ancient of Days sits, the hair on his head like clean fleece, his throne flames of fire. Imagining this and similar fantasies, the fool corporealizes God. He falls into one of the traps that destroy faith. His awe of God is limited by his imagination. So what is Cordovero saying? That really you're impoverished. Now, he doesn't mean financially impoverished. He means mentally or spiritually impoverished. You're impoverished if you think that God is an old man sitting in heaven. Now that, of course, is the traditional notion of God. Father in heaven, the king, the judge, seated up there and running the cosmic show. Cordovero says that's really a mistaken theology. That's an impoverished view of God. Notice he quotes a verse. This is actually a verse from the Bible, from the book of Daniel. The Ancient of Days sits, the hair on his head like clean fleece, his throne flames of fire. Now, usually when a rabbi quotes a verse from the Bible, he's trying to explain it, to expand on its meaning, to unpack it. Here, Cordovero is quoting that verse to criticize it. He says that's an impoverished view of God. So what is the alternative? Let's see how Cordovero continues. But if you are enlightened, you know God's oneness. You know that the divine is devoid of bodily categories. These can never be applied to God. Then you wonder, astonished, who am I? I am a mustard seed in the middle of the sphere of the moon, which itself is a mustard seed within the next sphere. So it is with that sphere and all it contains in relation to the next sphere. So it is with all the spheres, one inside the other. And all of them are a mustard seed within the further expanses. And all of these are a mustard seed within further expanses. Your awe is invigorated. The love in your soul expands. What is he offering as the alternative? What's the alternative to God as the Father in heaven, the male figure seated on the throne? Cordovero is really describing Ein Sof, the infinite. He doesn't use that word. He'll use it in a minute or two later in the next passage we look at. He's talking about God's oneness. God includes, contains everything. Now he talks about spheres. He's really using here medieval astronomy, in which the Earth was the center of the cosmos, and that's surrounded by concentric spheres, extending out the planets and the sun and the moon circling the Earth. Let's translate this into more contemporary cosmology. We live on the planet Earth, which we think of as pretty large, but really it's small compared to the solar system. And of course, the solar system is very tiny compared to the Milky Way. Right? We are one of perhaps millions and millions of solar systems, all circling the black hole at the middle of the Milky Way. But the Milky Way itself is just one galaxy of perhaps 100 billion galaxies strewn throughout the cosmos. And maybe there's a whole nother universe of which we're unaware. Maybe there's a multiverse and we are only in one universe. So we are tiny compared to the immensity of it all. That doesn't necessarily leave you with a very uplifting feeling. We seem to be lost in space. So why for Cordovero is that reassuring? Why does he say your awe is invigorated? The love in your soul expands? Because he is teaching that we are part of Ein Sof. It's not that God, the infinite, is somewhere out there. If infinity is really infinite, then it includes us. We are part of the infinite. Now, a mathematician, someone like Ed Witten or many other people in Princeton and elsewhere, would tell you that a fraction of infinity is how big? A fraction of infinity is actually itself infinite. Because if a fraction of infinity were finite, then we could figure out how big infinity is, but we can't. We don't know what infinity is. Even a fraction of infinity is infinite. So we somehow share in the infinite nature of the divine. You could say each of us is one spark of the divine whole, of the divine oneness. We are part of the divine. And that fact, that mystical fact, is what leads Cordovero to say that your awe can be invigorated by this alternate view of God. In other words, don't think of God as someone up there running the show. Think of God as the oneness that encompasses all, including each of us. Let's look at a couple more passages here, and then I'll take a question or two. This is still Moses Cordovero. The essence of divinity is found in every single thing. Nothing but it exists. Since it causes everything to be, no thing can live by anything else. It enlivens them. Its existence exists in each existent. That last word, existence, simply means any existing thing. Okay, so the divine is really being imagined here as an energy, the divine energy that animates everything. It's not any one thing by itself. The divine is that which animates everything. Do not attribute duality to God. We'll see in a moment what he means by duality. Let God be solely God. If you suppose that Ein Sof emanates until a certain point, and that from that point on is outside of it, You have dualized, God forbid. Realize rather that Ein Sof exists in each existent. Do not say this is a stone and not God. God forbid. Rather, all existence is God, and the stone is a thing pervaded by divinity. Sounds a little strange for a rabbi to say, this is a stone and not God. After all, we read in the Ten Commandments not to bow down, not to worship any graven image, any stone idol. So how can Cordovero say, don't say this is a stone and not God? Of course, Cordovero would never dream of bowing down to the stone, but he refuses to exclude God from the stone. In other words, for Cordovero, God is the energy that animates all of existence. And you see here the word Ein Sof. This is the phrase E-I-N-S-O-F, there is no end. That is the name that Cordovero chooses to call God. Now, what does he mean by dualism, by dualizing? Usually when we speak of dualism in a religious text, we mean that there are two gods, let's say a father and a son, right? This is the main Jewish objection to the Trinity. God is not three divinities. God is the oneness. And actually, we spoke about the 10 sefirot, the 10 qualities of God. There too, it seems like there is a plurality, a multiplicity, but the Kabbalah insists that those 10 are really one. But here, by saying dualism, Cordovero isn't talking about two kinds of God. He's criticizing the view that there's God and something else. In other words, for Cordovero, all existence is God. This may sound to some of you like teaching from Spinoza, right? Baruch Benedict Spinoza, the great Jewish philosopher, one of the great famous Jewish heretics who lived in the 17th century. Spinoza actually has roots in the Kabbalah. Spinoza had teachers who were immersed in Kabbalah, and Spinoza's teaching is a kind of secular Kabbalah. That explains some of the parallels we'll see between Spinoza's philosophy and the Kabbalah's teaching about God. Let's look at one more paragraph, and then I'll respond to a couple chats. If you'd like, you can send them to the host. This is still Moses Cordovero. Before anything from the source to emerge from that infinite ocean, before anything emanated, there was only Ein Sof. There was only God as infinity. Ein Sof was all that existed. Similarly, after it brought into being that which exists, there is nothing but it. You cannot find anything that exists apart from it, apart from Ein Sof. There is nothing that is not pervaded by the power of divinity. If there were, Ein Sof would be limited, subject to duality, God forbid. Rather, God is everything that exists, though everything that exists is not God. We'll come back to that line in a moment. It's obviously a paradox. It is present in everything, and everything comes into being from it. Nothing is devoid of its divinity. Everything is within it. It is within everything and outside of everything. There is nothing but it. Okay, again, it is Ein Sof. I've translated it rather than he, because here, of course, in Hebrew, it and he are the same word. But for Cordovero, God is not a masculine father in heaven, as I've said. God is infinity, so the pronoun it is more appropriate than he or she. What does he mean by this paradoxical line in the middle? God is everything that exists, though everything that exists is not God. I think what he's saying is that God animates everything, God brings everything into being, God sustains all that exists, but don't be fooled into thinking that any one thing or even the totality of material objects actually is equal to God. Somehow the divine transcends all of the individual manifestations that we encounter. Let me pause here and see if there are any questions. If anyone wants, I see some chats have been sent. So I'll ask Moshe or John to select a few. Let's say, why don't we take 3 for now? Then we'll go back to study some more texts, and we'll pause again in a little while.
Okay, we actually have one for now from Lewis Gitlin. Was the opposing or already existing philosophy of what God is a basic idea of the old man white hair? What did the Zohar and Kabbalists encounter as opposition when they framed their idea?
Yeah, I would say that the traditional notion of God really could be, Avinu Shebashamayim, our Father in heaven, right? We've just gone through Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur with Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. So most of the traditional descriptions of God in the Bible and the Talmud, and many medieval authors as well, picture God as the king seated on the throne, the divine judge, someone up there who's running the show. Now, I want to make it clear, it's not that the Zohar or the Kabbalah rejects that entirely. We saw a passage where Moses Cordovero was criticizing it, but immediately after writing that passage, he would likely go into the synagogue and pray the morning or the afternoon prayer and say again and again, Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you, O God, ruler of the universe, king of the universe. So it's not that the Kabbalah rejects entirely the traditional theology, but it somehow has discovered a new dimension of the divine that's not limited to a personal human-like figure. In some ways, they've learned a lot from Maimonides. And Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher of the Middle Ages, Moses Maimonides, he lived in the century preceding the Zohar. He lived in the 12th century. He died at the beginning of the 13th century. Maimonides insisted that we should not describe God in human forms, right? What's known as anthropomorphisms. We shouldn't give anthropomorphic descriptions of God, God as Father and King. We shouldn't think that's adequate. That's an adequate theology. So the Kabbalah has learned from Maimonides to go beyond the human descriptions of God. Those 10 Sefirot indulge in human description, but they are not the ultimate reality of God. The ultimate reality is Ein Sof, the infinite. And I would point out that at the very top of that diagram, let me pull it up again for a moment. At the very top of that diagram, the very first of all the Sefirot, Keter, the crown, it's also called the divine will, and it's given a paradoxical name, Ayin. This is Ayin spelled with an Aleph, Aleph Yud Nun, which means nothing or nothingness. I don't mean that it doesn't mean anything. It means the word nothingness. That's what Ayin means. Now, why would a Kabbalist call the highest of all these 10 qualities of God nothing? Really because this is a way of saying God is no thing. I think it's better pronounced no thingness than nothingness. God cannot be limited to any picture, any concept. God explodes all of our definitions. So this beautiful paradoxical name of Ayin is very similar to Ein Sof. If Ein Sof is the white space all around these Sefirot, the Kabbalah is saying that even when you get to the first specific Sefirah, the first specific quality, even that still exhibits infinity. It's known as no thingness or Ayin.
I have a question. There seems to be a Hindu quality here. Is there any record that can trace a connection?
Yeah, there certainly are parallels between the mysticism that we encounter in the Kabbalah and some of the insights of Buddhism or Hinduism. One of the exciting things about studying mysticism is that you find such clear parallels between mystics who lived in different centuries, in different countries, in different continents. And that raises the question that you raised, was there influence? Was there influence from Hindu scriptures upon the Kabbalah or some teachings of Buddhism on the early Kabbalists? It's certainly possible that there was some contact. The Silk Road, as we know, carried not only silk and merchandise, but also ideas and theories and religious texts. So it's possible that the Kabbalists came in contact, but I think it's also just as likely that different mystics in different locales and different ages came up with the same images. You might say by going deep within themselves, they discovered the beyond within. So I would say that you can find instances of influence. Certainly there are parallels with Sufism, right? Sufism, which is closer geographically. We know that some Kabbalists had contact with Sufis. Gershom Scholem, the great scholar of Kabbalah, has also identified certain teachings, Buddhist teachings that made their way to the Kabbalists in Spain. But those are relatively limited. And I would say it's more likely that you have different mystics discovering identical truths.
Okay, for now I have one more. Would you like to talk about the controversy between the Kabbalists and the Maimonideans?
Yeah, I've touched on that, so that's worth a little more time. Maimonides, as I said, passed away at the beginning of the 13th century. His great book, The Guide of the Perplexed, really describes what's called negative theology. That's what Maimonides offered, a negative theology. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that you put down theology. It means that it's better to say what God is not than to say what God is. If you say that God is strong, that makes God sound like some muscle man. If you say God is wise, that makes God sound like some endowed professor, although many professors are not so wise. So Maimonides says, don't go that route. Don't say what God is. Deny what God is not. Say God is not limited. God is not mortal. God is not subject to decay. It's better to clear away what God is not than to claim what God is. And the Kabbalah accepts this. You might say that the Kabbalah took it to an extreme. The Kabbalah, by calling that highest sphira ayin, nothingness, that's really taking Maimonides' insight of negative theology to the extreme and saying we can't put God into our verbal or mental containers. So that they've really learned from Maimonides. In some ways, there's a tension. There certainly is a tension between the Kabbalah and Maimonides. They learned from him, but they were troubled by the distance that Maimonides created between us and God. In other words, Maimonides makes God so abstract, so rationally depicted, that it's very hard to feel an intimacy. And Maimonides himself had a deep spirituality, but some of Maimonides' followers used Maimonides' teachings to say, for example, why does God need anything from us? Why does God need us to perform the commandments? All that we should do is picture God as God truly is, beyond our descriptions. It doesn't matter if we put on tefillin. It doesn't matter if we shake the lulav on Sukkot. Those are outmoded practices. So I'm not saying that Maimonides taught that. He did not. Maimonides insisted on complete observance of the mitzvot, but some of Maimonides' radical followers used the Maimonidean philosophy to justify their own lack of observance, their own lack of observing the mitzvot. To this, the Kabbalah reacts very strongly. The Kabbalah accepts what Maimonides says ultimately about God being infinite. Maimonides doesn't say that, but Ein Sof is really perfectly in line with Maimonides' theology. But the Kabbalah wants to preserve tradition. After all, Kabbalah means tradition, that which has been received. So the Kabbalists are deeply influenced by Maimonides, but are very much opposed to this relativization of mitzvot. They insist that performing the mitzvot, what's accomplished by performing the mitzvot? We come back to the sphirot. In that diagram of sphirot, remember I said that Tiferet is the masculine, also called the Holy One, blessed be He, the most typical rabbinic name for God. Tiferet is the Holy One, blessed be He. Shekhinah or Malchut is the feminine. And the goal of Judaism is to unite the masculine and the feminine. This means, on the one hand, to find a human partner, to find a spouse, but it means that we can bring about the union of the divine male and the divine female. The mysterious romance within God is one of the goals of this whole system of the Sphirot. And how do we do that? We have to do that. That's one way in which God needs us. That can only be accomplished through the mitzvot. By performing the mitzvot, we actually unify God. We unite the male and female halves of God. This is called Zivuga Kadisha, the holy union, the holy coupling. You might say that every mitzvah is an aphrodisiac for the divine romance. By observing Shabbat, by loving one's neighbor, by fulfilling all the mitzvot, we bring together the two halves of God. We declare and affirm and actualize the oneness of God. Let's take one more, because after this we're going to look at text for a while. If there's one more question, I'm happy to take it.
Okay. What does Moses Cordovero mean by Ein Sof animating everything or by energy?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say that infinity does anything. If infinity exists, then it includes everything. So how can the infinite act on something that's not part of the infinite? Everything is part of the infinite. This is really, a problem with language. And in the mystical text, you come up against the boundary of language, right? That's why the Zohar uses poetry, because poetry is a way to use language to break the limits of language. So I think Cordovero is reimagining God as the energy that animates everything. You could almost think of this as a physicist would describe the relationship between matter and energy. I don't mean to equate these totally, but it's a useful comparison. Think how a physicist would describe matter and energy. Really, for a physicist, matter is energy. Matter is energy that has slowed down temporarily and taken on a certain structure, a certain nuclear or molecular structure. But really, if you penetrate the outer layer of any material object, you will encounter energy. So energy is what constitutes matter. Of course, Einstein taught us this with E equals mc squared. Energy is equivalent to matter, but it's being freed, of course, has cosmic and potentially catastrophic results. But matter, one physicist has put it this way, matter is frozen energy. Matter is frozen energy. So the Kabbalah is saying the world as it exists is a manifestation of the divine energy. It's energy that has taken on a certain form. Cordovero was not a scientist, but I think what he's saying about the divine energy in the material world, we can come closer to an understanding of that by studying contemporary science. Okay, let's continue now with the texts we're looking at. We're going to go on to the next page of this PDF, Finding God in the Material World. We have one more teaching here by Moses Cordovero, Concealing and Revealing. When powerful light is concealed and clothed in a garment, it is revealed. Though concealed, the light is actually revealed. For were it not concealed, it could not be revealed. This is like wishing to gaze at the dazzling sun. Its dazzle conceals it, for you cannot look at its overwhelming brilliance. Yet when you conceal it, looking at it through screens, you can see and not be harmed. So it is with emanation. By concealing and clothing itself, it reveals itself. Okay, this is a bit perplexing and really somewhat frustrating. You might say this is what gives mysticism a bad name, saying something and immediately denying it. Why does he say, though concealed, the light is actually revealed? Were it not concealed, it could not be revealed? This sounds like nonsense, but let's be patient with Cordovero. I think what he's saying is this. Notice he compares it to looking at the sun. We all know that we can't look directly at the sun, right? Even during an eclipse, it's dangerous to look at it because the radiance, the radiation will still come to us, will still affect and harm our eyes. Something can be so bright that you can't see it. The sun is so dazzling you can't look right at it. So how can you look at it? Only by using a filter. If you filter the light, then paradoxically, by partially concealing it, you're actually revealing it. So strange as it sounds, the concealment is what allows for the revealing. He compares this to a garment. You could think of fashion. Someone told me this is really describing fashion. By concealing, you are highlighting. By concealing, you're making something more attractive. So how does this relate to God and creation? You really could say the divine light is too much to encounter in a raw state, in a naked state. So what does God do? God conceals itself. God conceals himself or herself or itself. God conceals itself by turning into the world. Nature is a concealed manifestation of the divine. This too brings us back to Spinoza. Spinoza equated nature and God. Nature is the manifestation of God. Cordovero is saying nature, the creation, is a concealed form of the divine. Okay, as he concludes in that last line, by concealing and clothing itself, it reveals itself. The next one on the same page, on the same side of the page, is not from Cordovero. It's another Kabbalist who lived in the 16th century. His name was Shimon Lavi. I should say all of the teachings we're looking at here, all of these, the texts of this PDF, are from my book, The Essential Kabbalah, which I translated passages from different stages of Kabbalistic creativity. This one is by Shimon Lavi, and look what he says. With the appearance of the light, the universe expanded. That sounds almost like the Big Bang. With the appearance of the light, the universe expanded. The Hebrew there is Ki behofia haor nitrachev haolam. With the appearance of the light, the universe expanded. With the concealment of the light, the things that exist were created in all their variety. This is the secret of the act of creation. One who understands will understand. That last line in the Hebrew is simply two words, v'hamevin yavin. One who understands will understand. If you get it, you got it. Okay, you find that in medieval Hebrew literature occasionally. Ibn Ezra, the biblical commentator Abraham Ibn Ezra, likes to say that. He sometimes gives a cryptic explanation and then says, v'hamevin yavin. One who understands will understand. So this whole teaching is only 4 lines, but the last line just says, if you get it, you got it. The third line just says, this is the secret. Okay, so we're really talking about 2 lines. The first 2 lines are the secret of creation. If we can understand those 2 lines, we understand this Kabbalist view of the secret of creation. So let's look at those 2 lines. The first one, as I said, reminds us of the Big Bang. Maybe in the 16th century, this was a deep secret. Now, every high school junior learns that in physics class. With the appearance of the light, the universe expanded. The second line is the intriguing one. With the concealment of the light, the things that exist were created in all their variety. Now that sounds strange. You would expect that he would say, with the revealing of the light, the things that exist were created. Why does he say, with the concealment of the light, the things that exist were created? I think this really goes in line with what we saw before. The light by itself would be too much to bear, too much to hold. If there were just the raw revelation of the divine, we would be blown away. We couldn't handle it. We couldn't endure that intense radiation. You could think of nuclear energy. You can't endure the intensity of that radiation. With the appearance of the light, the universe expanded, but there had to be a filtering of the light. There had to be, really, you could change just one letter. A scientist would say, not concealment, but congealment. When the energy congeals, right, when the expanding universe is acted upon by gravity, and the gases and the dust begin to coalesce, to congeal, forming stars, forming galaxies. It's that packaging, it's that limiting, it's that hiding of the light, in a sense, that allows for individual being, for individual objects to be created, to emerge. So somehow there's a pattern here, there's a rhythm of appearance and concealment, explosion of the light, and then a slowing down, a concealment or a congealment that allows for existence to endure. That is the secret. The rhythm of the two, the back and forth between those two opposites, that's the secret of creation. One who understands will understand. Okay, we're not going to look at all these teachings. We'll skip that next one. I want to go on to the next page of the PDF, bringing forth sparks. This brings us to another great Kabbalist who lived along with Moses Cordovero in the 16th century in that mountaintop city of Safed, of Tzfat, in the Galilee. I'm sure many of you have been there. It's now a center for art and creativity as well as mysticism. But in the 16th century, it was a great center of the Kabbalah. And Isaac Luria was the most famous person who lived there. He lived there only briefly, but he transformed Kabbalah. He took the teachings of the Zohar and developed new theology based on the Zohar. And this is something he says about the sparks, about divine sparks. You can mend the cosmos by anything you do, even eating. Do not imagine that God wants you to eat for mere pleasure or to fill your belly. No, the purpose is mending. The Hebrew word for mending is tikkun. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that word. Tikkun is repairing, mending, fixing the world. It includes social justice. It includes caring for other people. For Luria, tikkun takes on a cosmic dimension, even something as pedestrian, as simple, as daily, as eating a piece of bread, that can bring about tikkun. How so? Sparks of holiness intermingle with everything in the world, even inanimate objects. By saying a bracha, a blessing, before you enjoy something, your soul partakes spiritually. This is food for the soul. As the Torah states, one does not live on bread alone, but rather on all that issues from the mouth of God. Not just the physical, but the spiritual, the holy sparks springing from the mouth of God, like the soul herself, breathed into us by God. So when you're about to eat bread, say the motzi. Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz, who brings forth bread from the earth. Then by eating, you bring forth sparks that cleave to your soul. Okay, what is Isaac Luria saying? He's looking at the bracha. He's looking at the motzi, one of the best known brachot of all the rabbinic blessings. And he's saying, what happens when you eat? When you eat, you're nourishing yourself physically, but if you approach that act with kavanah, with intention, with mindfulness, then you're actually nourishing yourself not only physically, but also spiritually. The bread nourishes you physically. If you can contact the divine spark, the energy that animates that bread, if you can connect with that spark of God, then your soul is enriched. Your body is enriched by the calories of the bread. Your soul is enriched by the divine spark. And according to Luria, there are divine sparks in everything. So physical activity, if it's accompanied with a bracha, if it's engaged in with kavanah, with intention or mindfulness, can actually be a holy act. This really reminds us about the purpose of saying a bracha. Why did the rabbis invent brachot? You don't have many blessings, the formal blessings in the Bible. You don't have the motzi in the Bible. The motzi, blessed are you, O God, who brings forth bread from the earth, that and hundreds of other blessings were invented by the rabbis. Why do we say a bracha? Abraham Joshua Heschel, the great teacher of the 20th century, Heschel taught that the purpose of saying a bracha is to give us a sense of wonder, the wonder of being alive, the amazing fact that we are alive. We don't just immediately eat, we say a blessing thanking God for the food. We want to cultivate a sense of wonder. That's the purpose of saying a bracha. By the time of Isaac Luria, the brachot had become so ordinary that people were reciting them mechanically or not reciting them at all. So Luria is trying to fill the bracha with new meaning. When you say the bracha, you should have in mind not only the bread, but the divine energy that's animating the bread, and you should try to connect with that divine life force. Thereby you bring about mending. Why mending? Because you reconnect the individual material objects in the world to the divine source, to that energy. We're reconnecting the matter and the energy, you might say. This is expanded by later Jewish mysticism, by Hasidism. Now, what is the connection between Hasidism and Kabbalah? Kabbalah is earlier Jewish mysticism. The Hasidim took the ideas of the Kabbalah and tried to spread them to the masses. You really could say Hasidism is a kind of popularized Kabbalah. So look here what happens in Hasidism to this teaching of the sparks. When you eat and drink, you experience enjoyment and pleasure from the food and drink. Arouse yourself every moment to ask and wonder, what is this enjoyment and pleasure? What is it that I am tasting? Answer yourself, this is nothing but the holy sparks from the sublime holy worlds that are within the food and drink. This is from a teacher who's kind of right in between Kabbalah and Hasidism. So notice what he's saying. Luria said, by saying the motzi, you can discover the spark in the food. This teaching is going a little further. He's actually saying, if something tastes delicious, what does that mean? That means you've contacted the divine spark. Now, this is beautiful, but it's also somewhat dangerous. It could be used to justify gluttony. And in fact, we hear stories about Hasidic Rebbes. Some Hasidic Rebbes would pile food on their table, claiming that they wanted to raise many sparks. But of course, the point isn't the more the better. The point is to approach the experience of eating with an awareness of the wonder of life, the wonder of creation, that if something tastes delicious, you are being fed by this cosmic energy. Let's look at one more passage, and then we'll pause for some questions. On the right side of the page, what's entitled Ripples. I'd like to invite us to engage in a bit of meditation together. I want to read this with you, and then I'm going to read it again and ask us just to close our eyes and listen, and then sit in silence together for a minute or two. This passage is written by Moses de Leon, by that author of the Zohar, the main author of the Zohar, Moses de Leon, who lived in Spain, as I mentioned, in the 13th century. This is not from the Zohar. This is from one of his Hebrew books. The Zohar is written in Aramaic. Most of other books of Kabbalah are written in Hebrew. And Moses de Leon wrote this book in Hebrew, and here he really describes meditation. Thought reveals itself only through contemplating a little without content, contemplating sheer spirit. Well, let's just pause right there. You might ask, what does it mean to contemplate something without content? Every thought is a thought of something. How can you think without thinking of something? Moses de Leon is saying meditation is really contemplating without content. It's a beautiful description. It's a beautiful attempt to define meditation. Meditation is thinking, but without becoming fixated on any one thought. Just feeling the stream of mental energy. As soon as you fixate on one thought, you let that thought go. You don't fight the thought, but you don't hold on to the thought. As almost all teachers of meditation say, let the thought come in, but let it go out. And you're left just with a stream of mental energy, what he's describing as contemplating sheer spirit. And he immediately says how hard this is to do. The contemplation is imperfect. You understand, then you lose what you have understood. Like pondering a thought. The light of that thought suddenly darkens, vanishes. Then it returns and shines and vanishes again. No one can understand the content of that light. It is like the light that appears when water ripples in a bowl, shining here, suddenly disappearing, then reappearing somewhere else. You think that you have grasped the light when suddenly it escapes, radiating elsewhere. You pursue it, hoping to catch it, but you cannot. Yet you cannot bring yourself to leave. You keep pursuing it. It is the same with the beginning of emanation. As you begin to contemplate it, it vanishes, then reappears. You understand, and it disappears. Excuse me. Even though you do not grasp it, do not despair. The source is still emanating, spreading. Emanation again means the emergence of the divine light, the beginning of the revelation of God. So what is he saying? Notice he describes a technique. This is actually a Kabbalistic technique of revelation, of meditation, to sit in front of a bowl of water outside, to jiggle the bowl for a moment, to watch the light reflecting off the water. That for Moses de Leon is an image of the mental process. You might have an insight, you might have a flash of intuition, of revelation, but then it will go. You've lost it, you can't find it again. He's saying, don't despair. That's the nature of the beast. That's the nature of the mental process. There'll be an insight, there'll be a flash, and then it will go. Don't try to hold on to it. Just patiently sit there and wait for a new beam of light. I'd like to read that one more time, and I'll just ask everyone to sit in silence and to close your eyes if you feel comfortable doing that. I want to read this and then just bask together in a minute of silent meditation, and then we'll take some more questions. Thought reveals itself only through contemplating a little without content, contemplating sheer spirit. The contemplation is imperfect. You understand, then you lose what you have understood. Like pondering a thought, the light of that thought suddenly darkens, vanishes, then it returns and shines and vanishes again. No one can understand the content of that light. It is like the light that appears when water ripples in a bowl, shining here, suddenly disappearing, then reappearing somewhere else. You think that you have grasped the light when suddenly it escapes, radiating elsewhere. You pursue it, hoping to catch it, but you cannot. Yet you cannot bring yourself to leave. You keep pursuing it. It is the same with the beginning of emanation. As you begin to contemplate it, it vanishes, then reappears. You understand, and it disappears. Even though you do not grasp it, do not despair. The source is still emanating, spreading. Okay, let's slowly open our eyes, come back together. Ask one of the hosts to read a chat or two that have come in, and let's give preference to people who haven't asked a question yet. Please.
John, should I read?
Sure,
Okay.
please.
Okay, Daniel. Torah frequently discusses what God does, but says little about what God is. What motivated the Kabbalist focus here on what God is rather than on what God does?
Yeah, that's very interesting. If you read the Bible, there's a lot of God did or God said, but not much. Occasionally, right? Occasionally there is. You think of an exception, maybe an exception that proves the rule. Eheyeh asher eheyeh, I am who I am. You might say that there the Torah is giving a hint of what the Kabbalah will eventually say. After all, what is God saying when God says, I am who I am? God is really refusing to pin himself down. God is refusing to define himself. So that's really a precursor for the idea of Ein Sof. And Soph is a more formal, philosophical, theological way of saying, I am who I am. So you have those rare places in the Bible where there are hints at the nature of God. The Kabbalah takes those hints and expands them into a full-blown theology. This again has a lot to do with the influence of Maimonides. Maimonides spends years and years, decades, thinking about the nature of God, and the Kabbalah is reflecting on that and building on it, drawing on those rare verses in the Bible that also discuss it. Thank you.
Okay. Is it possible to say that the notions of God and reality can be used interchangeably?
Very interesting. God and reality. The thing is, some people prefer religious language, and some people have had very bitter or painful experiences with religion. They want to reject it entirely. So I would say it's not essential to use theological language. If you prefer to speak about reality rather than to speak about God, I think that's fine. I would just say that we shouldn't surrender religious language to one orthodox position. In other words, one danger of abandoning God talk is that you leave God talk completely in the realm of Orthodox theology. So what the Kabbalah, what Hasidism, what mystics around the world are saying is that there's a reality of God that cannot be captured in the traditional formulations. One way to say this is to quote the great Christian mystic, Meister Eckhart. And Meister Eckhart lived in the 14th century, right after the Zohar was written. Meister Eckhart says, I'm not so much interested in God, I'm interested in the God beyond God. So the God beyond God, what is that? The God beyond God is really Ein Sof, the traditional personal God, the God who stretches out his arm, the God who redeems Israel. That's God. And Sof is the God beyond God. So I think there are really two options you have: to leave the religious language aside and to speak about reality, or to update religious language, to revolutionize religious language and search for the God beyond God. They're both legitimate approaches.
Okay, quote, essence of divinity is found in every single thing, end quote. Is everything created? Is this essence of divinity related to the act of creation?
Yeah, I would say that what traditionally is spoken of as the act of creation turns in Kabbalah to the process of creation. In other words, it's not a one-time event that happened back at the beginning of the Torah, right? Yesterday we read the first portion of the Torah. Having completed the Torah, we began again with Genesis 1:1, with the creation story. And that describes God creating the world in that first week of creation. It's not that the Kabbalah denies that, not at all, but it says creation is happening eternally. Creation is not a one-time event. So the act turns into a process, and God itself turns into a process. There's a flow, there's a divine, what's called emanation, which isn't an event just in the past, it's something happening right now. Since I mentioned Bereshit, I mentioned the beginning of the Torah, I want to give you an example of how the Zohar interprets the Torah. The Zohar is, as I've said, a mystical commentary on the Torah. How does the Zohar interpret the very first verse? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created. Those three words form the basis of a very colorful, radical interpretation we find at the beginning of the Zohar, near the beginning of the Zohar. Now look closely at those three words. Bereshit, in the beginning. Bara, created. Elohim, God. In the beginning, God created. We translated in the beginning, God created, but the Hebrew is actually in the beginning created God. Now that's okay in Hebrew. In Hebrew, you can sometimes put the verb before the subject. This even happens in English occasionally, right? In very formal English, thus spoke the king, right? It means the king said this. But there you put the verb before the subject. In Hebrew, you can do that too, much more frequently. Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning created God. Of course, it means in the beginning God created. I dare you to find a Bible that would translate it, in the beginning created God. But that's how the Zohar understands the verse. In the beginning, not created, but it created. In the beginning, it created Elohim. Now, who is the it? The it is Ein Sof. The reason you don't see that word in the Hebrew is because a Hebrew verb, for example, bara, created, that can be translated created or it created or he created. That's how the Zohar interprets it. In the beginning, Bereshit, bara, it created, and Sof emanated, and Sof issued forth with Elohim. So Elohim, God, now becomes the object of the verse rather than the subject. This is very far-reaching. This is very radical. It's almost heretical. To say that God was created sounds impossible in a religious text, but the Zohar really means what? That Ein Sof produced what we think of as God. What we call God, Elohim, is not the ultimate divinity. It's what God becomes for our puny, limited minds. We picture God as Elohim. We picture God as Father in heaven, as a king, as a judge, or as a queen. Those human conceptions don't do justice to the ultimate reality of God in Sof. So the Zohar actually invents a new meaning for the very first verse in the Bible, a shocking meaning. In beginning, or really with the beginning, and Sof created Elohim. The Zohar loves to do that, to take verses in the Bible and almost turn them on their head to show a radical new spiritual meaning. This is why the Zohar was kept so secret, why you have so many restrictions about studying Kabbalah, because these teachings are really shocking, and they could lead one to reject much of the tradition. The Zohar was very conservative in its approach to tradition, but very radical in its approach to understanding God. And it wanted to make sure that these teachings were passed on only to people who were ready to appreciate them and understand them. Now, of course, you can find anything, you can print anything, you can discover anything online. So it's hard to keep the secrets hidden. But in the time of the Zohar, they were much more restricted.
One more?
Please, we can do a few more.
Okay, good. Could you please explain the difference between a Kabbalist saying that something has, in quote, divine spark, end quote, and the idea of animism, which proposes that everything is alive?
Animism. Yeah, you could say they're very similar. The main difference is that Kabbalah tries to do this within the framework of traditional Judaism. In other words, the Kabbalah accepts that there's a cascading energy, a teeming energy filling the universe, and yet it's committed to Shabbat, to Kashrut, to the mitzvot, because of this almost mythological view of that divine couple, the Holy One, blessed be He, and Shekhinah. Next week, we're going to delve into Shekhinah, the feminine divinity. But as I've said, the main point of Torah, the main point of life, according to Kabbalah, is to unite the divine couple. The only way to unite the divine couple is through the enactment of the mitzvot. So there's a mystical underpinning. There's an animistic view, you might say, in a sense, of energy and matter. And yet there's a vital significance to the traditional menu of mitzvot.
Okay, here's another one. If the purpose of the blessings is to bring about the spark, then why do they have to be in the language of the blessings we've been mindlessly reciting our whole lives? Why can't we just use our own words?
Why not use our own words? Yeah, I would say that Isaac Luria is trying to fill the mitzvot with new meaning because of the problem you're describing, because the brachot had become too hackneyed, right? Had become too automatic. He's trying to fill them with new life. What you're proposing is another option, which is to invent your own blessing. After all, the rabbis invented blessings. Why can't we invent blessings? I would say it's fine to invent your own blessing, but I think there's also value in plugging into the tradition. I would say the best approach is to balance tradition and creativity, to learn the brachot, to have them available, and to supplement them or to alternate between the traditional formulation and a new one that you would create.
Okay, this is more of a statement than a question, so I'll ask you to react, okay?
Sure.
Cosmologists supportive of the Big Bang theory of the emergence of the universe would not posit the need for a creator to get things started. The beginning of the universe is a result of poorly understood physics. The idea of the beginning of the universe is meaningless in modern cosmology. One can certainly see the similarities between the language of the Big Bang and the metaphors of the Kabbalists, but it would be a mistake to suggest that Kabbalah somehow anticipated current cosmological theories. It's all yours.
Yeah, I basically agree with that. I've written a book, some of you may know, God and the Big Bang. I think you mentioned, Moshe, God and the Big Bang, discovering harmony between science and spirituality. And there I go into some depth about how a contemporary cosmologist would describe the origins of the universe and how the Kabbalah describes it. There are parallels there, but I'm careful to say there, I'm not making the claim that Isaac Luria knew what Stephen Hawking would come up with, right? I'm not saying that Moses de Leon beat Einstein to it and knew what Einstein would say. I think that's far too simplistic. I think it's remarkable when you find certain parallels, and that we should be careful not to simply equate the two. But I would say too, if you asked a cosmologist, what happened at the very beginning, nearly all cosmologists would say we know what happened up to, 10 to the minus 43 second after the beginning. From that moment on, we can pretty much, using our knowledge, using the laws of science, we can describe the gases and the expansion of the universe, and even now the acceleration of the universe. All that can be mapped out. But to ask about the absolute initial moment, nearly all cosmologists would say science cannot get there, or science cannot yet get there. So there's some uncertainty about the absolute beginning, and I think we should be humble enough to accept that. I don't think we should fill in that gap with a religious explanation. I think we should admit our ignorance. We should even celebrate somewhat that ignorance. We shouldn't claim that we have it all. And I think it's really that science and religion, or science and mysticism, are pieces of the puzzle, and there is something to learn from each of them without using one to entirely displace the other.
Okay, want to go on, and I'm sure we'll get some more.
Yeah, since we really only have a little bit of time left, if there are questions there, I'm happy just to continue at this point with questions. It's nearly 2 o'clock, so if you have a few there, let's do that. If there are not more, then I'll begin with the material on Shekhinah.
Okay. Okay, wait a minute.
I can start us off on Shekhinah, and you can look for a few good questions. We could do it that way.
Okay, let's do that. Okay.
Great. Let's take a look at. By the way, there's another page here which we're not going to do right now. The last page of this PDF we're on. We may look at it next week, or I may leave this for homework for people. But for now, let's just look at the very beginning of this material on Shekhinah. In some ways, this is the most exciting element within the Kabbalah, because, as I mentioned, all of Western religion is so dominated by the male perspective. I'm sure many of you know the feminist writer Mary Daly. In the 1970s, she said something very provocative, which was that as long as God is male, the male is God. Right? In other words, as long as we picture God as father, as this masculine entity, then men rule. Men are dominating. Men justify their domination of women by pointing to a male divinity. So it's very important, not only for religion, but for culture, for society, for human rights, to balance the masculine dimension of God, the masculine aspect of God, with the feminine. And Shekhinah is the name for the feminine half of God. Shekhinah is not invented by the Kabbalah. Okay, Shekhinah, that word never appears in the Bible, but you find it very frequently in the Talmud and Midrash. And we're going to begin now just with two lines about Shekhinah. The first is, En makom ba'aretz panui min hashchina. There is no place, literally, there's no place on earth empty of Shekhinah. This shows you what Shekhinah means in rabbinic Judaism. It's not a feminine half of God. The word grammatically is feminine because all Hebrew nouns are either masculine or feminine. What this means is that Shekhinah is the immanence of God, the presence of God, what's sometimes called the omnipresence of God, the notion that God fills the universe. That's conveyed by the idea of Shekhinah. Literally, Shekhinah means dwelling. Shachan means to dwell. So Shekhinah means God's presence dwelling in the world. Don't think that God is just up in heaven. God fills the universe. Okay, you have this already in the Bible without the word Shekhinah. In the prophet Isaiah, Melo chol haaretz kavodo. Sure, many of you are familiar with that. Kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. Melo chol haaretz kavodo. The whole world is filled with his presence, with his kavod, with his glory. So Isaiah says that the world is filled with the divine glory, and the rabbis come up with this word Shekhinah, which describes God's presence filling the world. Number two, we'll explore this, we'll begin again next week with this, but let's look at it now, just number two. B'chol makom shegalu, wherever Israel went in exile, Shekhinah imahem. Shekhinah was with them. So Shekhinah is not just God's presence in the world, Shekhinah is God's intimacy with the Jewish people. Those are the two main components of the idea of Shekhinah before we get to the Kabbalah, before we get to the Zohar. And let's stop there. We have a few minutes left, and let's use that time for any further questions.
Okay, I have, this is very thought-provoking question, I think. As a secular Jew who does not say brachot, can Kabbalah still be appreciated in its wholeness, or is practicing the full Jewish traditions key to integrating Jewish mysticism?
It's a good question. Yeah, I would say that to be accurate about Kabbalah certainly involves Jewish practice. As I said, the performance of mitzvot is vital to bringing together that divine couple, the Holy One, blessed be He, and Shekhinah. So I would say that to be honest to Kabbalah certainly involves mitzvot at its core. On the other hand, I would say if you have a secular lifestyle, there's still very significant things about Kabbalah that could be useful to you. One of them is reimagining God. Okay, what we've talked about. God is not someone up there running the show. God is the energy that animates the universe. That idea of God could make you question that sharp distinction between secular and religious. In other words, if you reimagine God, then I think there's a way to be religious or to be spiritual without being traditional. That's one of the things that Kabbalah makes possible. there's a very fine teacher of Jewish spirituality, Zalman Schachter. I'm sure many of you know of him or read things by him. And he used to say, someone would come to them and say basically something similar to what you're saying, that I'm an atheist and I don't believe in God. And Zalman Schachter would say, the God you don't believe in, I don't believe in either. In other words, he rejected the traditional confines in which we usually place God. My book, God and the Big Bang, a number of people have said to me, scientists and others, that the book enabled them to come to an appreciation of spirituality, or even to be religious. I think you can be spiritual without necessarily committing oneself to the full regimen of the mitzvot. And what makes that possible is reimagining God. That's really what the Kabbalah is doing, reimagining God. So I would say just to play with that a little bit, to look at these teachings, or to delve into one of my books or other books, and to look for a way to reimagine God, and to enable us to question that sharp divide between secular and spiritual.
Okay. Could you please delve into why we were created, performing mitzvot, and our longing for oneness?
Why we were created. I think to answer
That's
that,
an
I'd like
easy one,
to.
isn't it?
Sorry?
That's an easy one.
I think to answer that, I want to take into hand a book. One second. I'd like to read you a passage. This is from my book, The Essential Kabbalah, if you've been studying. The very first passage in the book is from a Kabbalist named Abraham Abulafia, and I called it The Purpose. This is what he says, the purpose. The purpose of the marriage of a woman and a man is union. The purpose of union is fertilization. The purpose of fertilization is giving birth. The purpose of birth is learning. The purpose of learning is to grasp the divine. The purpose of apprehending the divine is to maintain the endurance of the one who apprehends with the joy of apprehending. This is a wonderful teaching because it starts off so simple. You just say, of course, of course, of course. And then by the time he gets to the end, you say, huh? What's he saying? So let's just go over it simply. The purpose of marriage is union. The purpose of that is fertilization. The purpose of fertilization is giving birth. Now it starts getting interesting. The purpose of birth is learning. He's really saying the purpose of life is learning. Right? Why are we gathering together here on a beautiful Sunday afternoon? Why aren't we out playing something or in exploring something? Because we feel a hunger. We feel a yearning to learn in a deeper sense what Judaism is about, what life is about. The purpose of birth is learning. Then he says the purpose of learning is the ultimate learning. You could say to grasp ultimate reality, to grasp God. But here we could identify God as ultimate reality. The purpose of learning is to grasp ultimate reality. Okay, for a physicist, for a cosmologist, for a musician, for a sculptor, for a dancer, the purpose of learning is to grasp the ultimate. What's the purpose of that? Okay, even that isn't the ultimate. What's the purpose of grasping the ultimate? The purpose of apprehending the divine or the ultimate is what? To maintain the endurance of the one who apprehends with the joy of apprehending. Okay, this sounds almost circular. I think he's saying the purpose of learning is to keep discovering. We're never going to get to it. We're never going to get to some statement that gives us the truth of existence so that we can write it down and put it in our pocket and now I have truth. That's a delusion, he's saying. The purpose of learning isn't to get to X. The purpose of learning is to keep on learning, to keep on discovering. And there's a joy in discovering which fuels us, which is the fuel. The joy of discovering fuels us to keep discovering. That's the purpose. The purpose is an endless, joyous discovery. So I think that's an appropriate way not to end, but to pause And we'll continue next Sunday to explore some more. So, thank you.
Daniel, on behalf of all of us, just thank you so much.